Hello. Joining us today in the program is the Executive Director of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Many of you may know him as somebody in a different capacity, the founder of NORML, Keith Stroup. Stroup?
No, you said it right.
Keith Stroup. Welcome to our show. Now, you started NORML is the impression I got. You're the founder of NORML. How did that all get started? How did that come about?
Well, I was coming out of law school, and I graduated in 1968, and if you remember, those were the height of the anti-war years. So like a lot of law students, I'd first been introduced to marijuana as part of the anti-war movement. It was, back then, if you smoked a marijuana cigarette, you were making as much a political statement as you were enjoying a recreational drug. You were essentially thumbing your nose at the establishment that had gotten us into the quagmire of Vietnam. But what began to happen were a lot of friends began to be busted. And literally the first few months I was out of law school, I had 2 or 3 friends come to me who had been stopped because they either had long hair and got the attention of the police, or drove a van, or there were all kind of peace signs were on their bumper, or whatever. And when they'd pull them over, of course, they'd find a joint under the seat or whatever. And as a young lawyer trying to figure out how to help these folks, I had also just spent 2 years working on a group called the National Commission on Product Safety. It was my way to stay out of Vietnam, to be real honest. I managed to get a critical skills deferment and to avoid having to go to the war, and I was about 10 days away from having to ship out when I got that. So I spent 2 years working closely with Ralph Nader, and I was impressed by the techniques he used. And it seemed to us that instead of trying to deal with individuals one by one who were being arrested for marijuana, and at that point, by the way, the arrest rates were about, I think, about 650,000 people a year, and over 90% of those were for simple possession of an ounce or less. And they were going to jail for long periods of time, especially in states like Texas, but actually all over the country they were. So we thought if we could start an organization that approached the problem the way Nader did on a lot of his issues, with a consumer perspective, and to focus on the unfairness of treating otherwise law-abiding citizens who weren't threatening in any way at all as criminals simply because they preferred to smoke a marijuana cigarette rather than drink alcohol, that there was a good bit of appeal to that if you made that case effectively. So NORML really was a concept that we sat down, thought up, and put together.
And then you took that concept and you made that grow nationwide.
Well, there certainly had been people with similar ideas before. There had been small groups springing up in different parts of the country. I had trouble getting good funding. It was obviously not a very popular issue back then. I'm talking now 68, 69, and 70. You were perceived as being radical and certainly out of the mainstream. I managed to get some pretty good funding. I managed to get Playboy Foundation behind the project early on. Hefner would give us space in the magazine to focus on victims, where if we were able to go in and get someone out of jail or whatever. So over a period of a couple of years, we did a lot of traveling. We'd go to Texas, where the situation was probably the worst, and we'd take journalists through the Texas prison system, for example, because we wanted them to meet these people who were being locked up and to see who these victims really were. And in the process of that, the name NORML obviously got some currency, and it began to be recognized by at least a minority of the folks in the country as the public interest group working on marijuana. The major step forward in solidifying the country under one banner had to do with Amorphia on the West Coast. It's a fascinating group that Gordon Brownell and Michael Aldridge and there was a third person had put together, and it was a legalization group, and they raised their funds by selling rolling papers made from cannabis. And if you keep in mind, cannabis is what it's used in Canadian currency. It's used in a lot of things, but it was nonetheless it was an interesting idea because you could, in theory, raise your money from your own constituents to fund the project. The problem was, back then it was similar to, I think, the political situation today. If you were perceived as being pro-pot, of trying to turn on the world, you really couldn't get access to legislatures, and you wouldn't get access to the major media. So we always said we didn't encourage the use of marijuana, but we recognized that for millions of people who made the choice to use it, that's their choice. It's part of the right to privacy. So Amorphia had trouble making their project work because they were perceived as a little bit over the line. So we got to know them. They were doing very good work on the West Coast, and we were doing good work in most of the rest of the country. So we merged Amorphia with NORML. We opened up a West Coast office. One of their people ran it. One of their people came back and helped me run the East Coast office. And so from about 1973 on, I think most of the serious work on marijuana law reform was done under the banner of NORML.
Now, when I was first hearing about NORML back in the 70s, I'm from Indiana, and news travels a little slower, usually 2 or 3 years behind.
I'm from Southern Illinois, so I know it.
Okay. We were always under the impression that if you got busted for anything, whether it was a joint, a bag, no matter where you were at in the United States, if you got into a spot, call NORML. They're there at your side, and they'll fight for you.
Well, and I think we pretty well did that. Now, I'm sure there were cases where the help we offered them may not have been as comprehensive as one would like to offer, but we had a lot of calls. But we also had a lot of young lawyers like myself, but spread all over the country, who were getting out of law school about 67, 68, 69. They'd been radicalized by the anti-war movement. They began to get active in other social issues. So it was feasible back then that when those phone calls came into my office in Washington, I could pick up the phone, and I had lists of half a dozen or more dedicated active lawyers in almost every state that would, at no cost, drive across the state or whatever, get a bail hearing, get this poor kid out of jail, figure out if they could negotiate something, or if not, represent him. And most of those times for no fee at all. They were really dedicated lawyers. So I think that was an accurate perception of a lot of our activity in the 70s. But again, keep in mind that we had to help people, because that's what the guts of the issue was about. And we also had to make sure the rest of America who didn't smoke marijuana got to know some of these people. And the way we did it was we would go help them, and then we would, with their permission, publicize the case, both in the local media and sometimes in the national media.
When did that start to change? I know that people now, sometimes when they ring up NORML, they have difficulties in reaching assistance.
I'm not sure I can exactly follow it. I can tell you I was with NORML from, well, we started it in 1970, and I left in mid-1979, so I ran it for about the first 10 years. Their political side, I think, atrophied during the 80s. They still have an active legal committee, but it's a legal committee that mainly holds CLE programs. In other words, they train other lawyers. And they do some very good work, and they have some of the finest lawyers in the country that still are active on that side. But when the political climate of the country began to get more conservative, I would say the parents group started making a big impact, anti-drug impact in the late 70s, and then they really took hold in the early 80s. NORML got positioned somehow to where they were no longer allowed to play. If you had a legislative hearing in Congress or in one of the states during the 70s, they wouldn't have thought about having a hearing without inviting us to have at least one spokesperson. And in fact, the majority of the hearings that were held, we put on. We had a traveling roadshow of psychiatrists and pediatricians and researchers. Dr. Whipple, a wonderful pediatrician in her 80s, Zinbergen, Weil at Harvard, Ungerleider at UCLA. We had some world-recognized psychopharmacologists and others who were willing, and we would raise the money to do this, but we would line up 3 or 4 states and set up state legislative hearings and take these people state to state so they could hear from the real experts.
Excellent.
Sometime in the early 80s, they quit allowing NORML to participate, and we were defined once again, or the organization was, as being too radical. But I don't think NORML had changed. I think the country had changed. It had gone this direction, to the right.
Okay. Now, I know that our laws have gotten a little different over the past several years, and we hope to cover some of these aspects and your opinions, if they've gotten worse or better, when we come back after this. Welcome back to our discussion with Keith Stroup. Keith, do you think that the laws have gotten worse or better? I mean, in some ways they've gotten, we know that we got the medical taken care of now, maybe in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And so that is positive, but on the overall, do you think they've gotten worse or better?
Well, it shows one's age to be able to put it in perspective, but I will tell you that if you've been at this for a while, or if someone's been focusing and interested in the drug issue for some time, in the late 60s, it was the first war on drugs was announced by the president, and they passed a major anti-crime bill. I believe it was in '69, that in fact included a provision introduced by then Congressman Ed Koch, who of course subsequently was the mayor of New York for many years, to require him to set up something called the Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, and it sort of went unnoticed by the DEA and the government agencies that thought they were getting through, this first anti-drug bill. Now, I'll connect back up with that in a second, but in answer to your question, the laws at that time were very tough indeed. For example, in 1970 and 71, in the state of Texas, they had over, it's been a while since I've thought about these figures, but they had over 100 people locked up for life sentences for possession of an ounce or less of marijuana.
Life sentence?
For life sentences. They had something like 600 people serving more than 30-year terms. So there were pockets of the country where the laws were as outrageous then as they are in the worst place today. I think the major change has been that people are more aware of the tough laws now because they tend to be federalized. Congress every year tries to outdo what they did the year before, and they pass more minimum mandatories, and they pass more death penalty categories where people can be put to death. It has no impact, of course, on crime. It has no impact on drug use, but it's a demagogic experience that politicians find works for them, so they keep doing it. So things are, I would say, about as bad now as they've ever been, because you've now had all of the Reagan era and 2 years of the Bush era where they're trying to outdo themselves and show how against drugs they are by locking up more and more people. But I will say this, I don't think it's any worse today than it was in the late 60s, early 70s, and in particular, I don't think the climate overall is any worse.
Okay.
You got to remember, we were coming out of the reefer madness era, and we hadn't moved very far beyond that by the late 60s. There were still people that thought if you smoked marijuana, it was addictive or it made you commit violent crimes. I mean, things that now seem kind of, well, like children might talk about, but nobody who's educated would discuss those things. They were perceived as being accurate in the late 60s. So what I see is a cyclical movement where, interestingly, there was a book by David Musto, a professor of history at Yale University, that he used to do some testifying for us, that he talks about the history of narcotics legislation generally. And it tends to go in, say, decade-long jumps where you'll go for a decade and the country will be somewhat permissive. Especially if the economy is doing well, we tend to be a little bit more willing to let our neighbor do what they want as long as they don't bother us. And so you get in a period where, as we were in the early 70s up through really the late 70s, where the country essentially said, we don't really care if you smoke marijuana. Don't flaunt it in our face, but we shouldn't lock you people up in jail with real criminals. But at some point, then the pendulum starts swinging back, and clearly for the last 12, 13 years, it has been going in a more conservative direction. But that too will change. And I suppose what I want people to understand is it is often during the times of the worst repression or oppression that political activists and public interest associations do their most creative and most valuable work. Our best work at NORML, I honestly believe, was during the early and mid-70s when it was tough out there and there was a threat of being arrested at every stop, and the police were, they didn't even want us coming into town. When we started making progress and started being more acceptable, and then when Jimmy Carter became president, etc., it was difficult to know what to do. We weren't used to being insiders. So I would suspect what you're going to see is, as bad as things are today, 3 or 4 years from now, I think we will look back and feel very good about the progress and unexpected progress in a lot of cases that are going to be made in the next few years. I don't think it's a hopeless situation.
God, I hope so. There are so many people out there now.
Oh yeah, I know.
Victims. Now, you commented earlier in our discussion that you worked in association with Ralph Nader. Now, that must have been interesting and beneficial to what you were doing at NORML.
Well, I think he's the ultimate public interest lawyer and probably the role model for hundreds and hundreds of people who came along after him. I was lucky in that when I was hired at this Commission on Product Safety, they hired 4 young lawyers right out of law school. And our immediate boss was a lawyer from Harvard who had been Ralph Nader's roommate in law school. And when Nader first came and set up his first public interest group in Washington, this man had been his executive director. So it gave me a chance to study at the feet of people who I consider to be the masters. I think they probably defined the whole field of public interest law.
Okay. Now, do you see the hemp movement taking a major effect into the economy soon? And if so, on a national scale? Or is it a global outside of America? Or
well, I've been fascinated by the attention paid in the last year or two, finally, to arguments that had sometimes been made earlier, but apparently didn't catch on for some reason. What I saw is during the 70s, we focused on getting kids out of jail, or people out of jail for smoking grass. That seemed to be the area that needed the attention, and also the area that people were willing to reconsider. Maybe they are overreacting to this whole question of whether somebody smokes a joint. The medical issue began to come along in the mid-'70s when I remember when Bob Randall first walked in my office and said, "I'm a glaucoma patient. When I smoke marijuana, my vision clears up." I thought this is wonderful news. I also wondered if I was dealing with somebody who was a little flaky. Now, over the years, obviously, I got to know Bob. I greatly respect him, and he's led the charge on this whole question of the medicinal uses of marijuana. But for a number of years, I think that issue has carried its burden. There's been probably more progress made in that part of the drug issue in the last 10 years than in any other. Now what I see is this economy, or ecology and economy movement beginning to discuss seriously what hemp could do for our economy and how it could help us avoid polluting our ecology. All of that is both good in the sense that I think it has merit in its own right. It's also good because it makes it more difficult for those who want to continue to treat us as criminals to justify marijuana as some evil drug. So I'm delighted at the movement. I suspect that it has a lot of, there'll be a lot of progress in that area too.
Okay, now currently you're working for the National Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers. Could you tell us a little bit what that's about, and does it still allow you to keep your hand active in the hemp movement?
Well, I haven't really for the last 10, 12 years. I haven't been active in it. I still know some of the people, and occasionally I'll drop by a meeting or something. I certainly feel a sense of history and connection to it. But the hemp movement, I think, is kind of a younger person's game. Not entirely, but I mean, I think it's important for all issues that every few years you have a new young group of idealistic and committed and energized people who care very much about the issue that you kind of pass the baton to. Sometimes they take it. I mean, they're just good enough, they start doing good work, and you start realizing you want to help them with their projects. Now, what I do now is not terribly different, but it's not quite as focused. I represent a cadre of lawyers who are terribly committed to the Bill of Rights. They're very concerned that the war on drugs has in fact become a war on the Constitution. And that what the Supreme Court has done in essence is they've created an exception to the Fourth Amendment that's a drug exception. If drugs are involved in a fact situation, they will overlook police conduct or overlook the absence of a warrant and justify it on the basis of it's drugs. But if it's in an area without drugs, absolutely, they throw the evidence out. Well, there's no drug exception in the Constitution. That's been created. They don't call it that, but that's what they've done. So I do much the same kind of work, but it's a little more broad-based. We oppose the death penalty. We train criminal defense lawyers so that they can do a better job at assuring that a citizen who is arrested has a fair chance to tell his side of the story, and that unless the government meets their burden, that individual ought not to be in jail. It's important work. It's not terribly different from what I did at NORML.
Okay. We have about a minute left. Our audience, I'm sure, is very interested in your background and your knowledge and your perception of your avenues that you've walked down in life. Is there anything that you'd like to share that would be
well, I'll tell you, there was once when I was young, I'm 47, so when I was younger, I guess I'm not quite dead yet, but I went to Ramsey Clark when I was first thinking about starting NORML, because he was a hero of mine from his anti-war work, etc. And I wanted to do it. I had it formulated, but it was a little scary to quit my job and jump off the deep end. Ramsey said to me, I'd read his book, I'd read his book, Crime in America, and he talked about the need to legalize drugs. He said, "Keith, do it." And I said, "Well, I want to, but I need encouragement from people like you who I respect, and you're wiser. It seems kind of suicidal." And he said, "Do it when you're young, when you can be idealistic and make those kinds of risks, take those kinds of chances. When you're older and you have kids in college, you have other considerations you have to make." So I would say the same thing to younger folks. If you've got a sense of commitment and you feel that something you care about is important enough, follow that. It really is important. I have never had a moment of regret for the 10 years I spent running NORML.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed having you on our show. I'd like to have you come back sometime.
Thank you, Casper.
And until we have the opportunity to get together, keep active in your community, keep healthy, keep wise, keep strong.